A final farewell. Love that transcends death. Harold Wood sat beside his wife's bed. The white clinical sheets, all ruffled from her tossing and turning, lay across her body as she slowly breathed, the air seemingly rattling as it filled her lungs. Outside, the busy ward echoed with the low hum of quiet speech and laughter in equal measure. But they were apart from it all in a small private room at the bottom of the corridor. A cloudless blue sky was visible through the large square window beside the bed, but the sight brought him no solace, and may as well have shown roiling clouds filled with the promise of torrential rainstorms for all he cared. Staring down at his hands, not wanting to look at her lying there grimacing periodically as wave after wave of pain coursed through her delicate frame, Harold began counting the brown age spots on the back of his hands before frowning at the grey hair supplanting what was once, a long time ago, brown. His distraction techniques had been well practiced in the past few days, since she had become less responsive, and pain regularly written on her beautiful face. As he moved his hands to pick imaginary fluff from his grey trousers, her hand flinched. The movement caught his attention, and he watched as her slim fingers lifted slightly and flexed invitingly. So he took her hand in his for the first time since he'd arrived in that room 20 minutes before. It fit like a glove. It always had. As he held her hand, he noted that her soft skin felt wonderful. He looked down at it in wonder. All these years those hands had lifted, cleaned, and wiped their children's snotty faces and soiled bottoms, but for all of that, they never lost their beauty. He raised her hand up, and then placed it on his cheek. The warmth he felt from her touch filled his eyes with tears. For the first time today, he looked into those blue eyes he loved so much. They were still as clear as mountain pools, yet he saw her suffering, along with the fear that came with the knowledge of what that brought. This moment was coming, and they knew it. For 3 weeks they had prepared for it. She'd told him, "Harold, don't you go getting all emotional when the time comes. I need you to be the strong man I married. You hear me?" He had agreed. At the time, he thought he could be strong, but sitting here now, seeing his wife clinging to life, filled him with helplessness and fear. Yet he placed a smile on his face as he gazed into her eyes, all the while knowing he could do absolutely nothing to ease her pain. His chest ached as he tried to smile. Tears rolled down Harold's face. He had to look away. He returned his attention to the hand he was holding. He kissed it ever so softly, remembering all the time she had done the same for him. Closing his eyes to recall those tender moments sent a cascade of tears down his cheeks. His chest heaved with the beginning of a sob. Harold stopped abruptly as the delicate fingers squeezed his. He opened his eyes, knowing what had to be done. "Sarah, my beautiful flower," Harold began. "I wish I was a better man to you than I have been these 40 years. Her eyes narrowed, and she pursed her lips in disagreement, but he wouldn't let her stop him this time. "I have, my love, been a poor husband, always looking after myself before taking care of you. All the while never truly showing you how much I appreciate everything you have ever done for me." He kissed her hand again, then pressed it against his cheek as he continued. "I have loved you every minute and every second since the first time I laid eyes on you outside the newsagents all those years ago. I knew in that moment you would be mine, but I didn't know how much I would come to cherish you. The sad thing is," he cleared his throat as his voice trembled with emotion, "for what reward have you put up with me all these years? The grumpy, selfish old man that I am." She smiled as she cried, a single tear falling down her angelic face. Sarah had lost the ability to speak after the operation to remove her tumour. Harold had joked that it would be bliss to be able to get a word in edgewise. In truth, he missed the sound of her voice more every time he looked at her. The expressions in her eyes communicated so much that he realized what he had been missing too late. Now, here she was, dying, yet there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Listen, it's a bit late, but I want you to know how much I have loved being your husband, friend, and life partner. I wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for you. But I can't keep coming back to see you suffer like this." She smiled, then shook her head in that dismissive way she used to let him know it was fine and he was no bother at all. It was all too much. Harold began to cry again. "Sweetheart, for the first time in our married life, you must put yourself first," he sobbed. "I can't be selfish anymore. I have to let you go. You need to move on, darling, and let this pain end." His words of pleading hung in the air between them, her head cocked to one side. Her beautiful face lit up with a knowing smile as she let out a deep breath. He stood, then placed a kiss on those wonderfully sweet lips. Harold paused, with his lips on hers, not wanting to lift his head as he knew what had just happened. The woman who had given birth to his children, cared for and been his rock for nearly half a century, was gone. He now felt his own soul cry out in agony as the realization settled into his very core. It had been moments since Sarah had left. Harold had gathered her belongings from the cupboard next to her bed as a stream of people came in and out of the little room. He had heard conversations, felt reassuring hands placed on his shoulders, but he didn't take any notice. He diligently folded her clothes and then placed her little trinkets in his Tesco carrier bag, all the while not wanting to look at the empty body that lay where his wife had been just minutes earlier. Time seemed to slow. The feeling of trudging through it was like carrying an elephant on his back. He was aware of a hand that turned him from his task and pulled him around to look at his little girl, Moira. He could see the sorrow in her face. He wanted to take it all away, but he couldn't do or say anything. He pulled her to him, letting her cry on his shoulder. The room had emptied, he noticed. His daughter sobbed words he couldn't hear. Although he was with her, he felt suddenly alone. His insides were churning. His heart ached with the emotions trying to escape. He placed a hand on his daughter's head and began to stroke her hair. In his other hand was the bag of his wife's belongings, but it ached to hold her hand, and he pressed his eyes closed as her face appeared in his mind. Moira heaved as another sob hit his chest, and Harold wished he had the words to comfort his little girl. But it had always been Sarah who knew the right thing to say. A short while later, his eldest child, David, arrived with his wife, Lisa. Sarah had said so many times that David was just like him, and the dark hair and broad shoulders were certainly distinctive, but Harold could never see himself in either of his children. They were undoubtedly copies of their mother in his eyes, and he loved them for that. As his son embraced him and then his sister, Harold could see tears rolling down his face. Lisa, with her short red hair held back from her round face with a black band, watched on sobbing into a tissue. She looked lost. Harold knew he had to say something to help his children come to terms with what had happened. He thought hard to find the words, but nothing suitable appeared. "It's all right, kids," he said finally. "She is finally free from the pain and is in a better place." David lifted his head to look at his father. His eyes were filled with tears as he nodded agreement with what he had heard. "Are you okay, Dad?" he asked. "Me?" Harold answered. "I'll be fine. We knew it was coming, and I suppose I have some planning to do." Moira pulled away from David and looked at her mother's lifeless body on the hospital bed. The covers had been neatened by the nurses and her arms placed atop the covers, so she looked like a small child tucked up for the night. "She looked so peaceful, Dad. Were you here? You know, when she went?" "I was. Do you know, there hasn't been a single day in our lives together we haven't seen each other. Not a single one." He smiled, remembering. "She never failed to be at my side when I needed her," he stated. "She needed me here. I wouldn't have been anywhere else." Lisa began to rub her husband's back. "I will go and speak with the doctor, love. See what needs to be done." David smiled approvingly, then watched as she left the room, letting the door close with a gentle click. "Well, I think a cup of tea is in order," David said, breaking the silence that had covered the room. Harold saw his son's chest inflate, as if readying himself for something, as he looked at his sister, then back to Harold. He looked at the full cup of liquid on top of the table, then placed his hand around it. "You need a brew, Dad? This one's stone cold." "Shall we go to the cafeteria?" he asked, tentatively. "Moira can wait for the doctor to see what's what, can't you, sis?" Moira looked from her mother, then blinked at Dave. "What? Oh, yes, you get yourself away, Dad. We'll handle the rest. You must be exhausted." Harold looked at his children in turn and smiled. David's concern was most welcome, as was Moira's, but for their age, David was 38 and Moira 33, they didn't seem to understand. "That's a lovely offer, thank you. But I couldn't leave her. Not when I still have her little things to pack up." He pointed to the carrier bag. "You see?" They both looked at each other, then back to Harold. Moira burst into tears as she sat down in the armchair next to her mother's bed. David stood silent for a moment, looking like a little boy who had lost his toys. "If that's what you want to do, Dad. Do you need a hand?" Harold shook his head. "I'll be all right. It's something your mum would want. She was a very private person, you know, didn't like a fuss either. So it's best if I collect her bits and not bother anyone else." With that, he resumed collecting his wife's belongings. He lifted her bottle of orange from the top of the bedside stand, adding it to the other stuff inside the bag. A moment later, the door opened and let the buzz of chatter from the corridors and other wards rush into the room. Harold turned to see Lisa walking through the door with the doctor. David stepped forward, straightening the blue short-sleeve shirt he was wearing to meet the doctor. Harold was glad, as he didn't want to talk, so as they all began to discuss things, he continued with his task. It was good that David had taken the lead and had made it his duty to spare his father from the details about how they were to remove the body, as well as questions about funeral services, etc. Soon, all his wife's belongings were neatly placed inside his bag. He looked up to find David sitting on the edge of the bed with Lisa. Moira was still in the armchair beside it. "Are we all ready to go?" he asked. David placed a hand on his wife's arm before looking at his sister. They still had tears in their eyes, but knew it was time to go. "Let's get you home, Dad," he said as they stood to leave the room. Harold moved back to the bed, then lifted the hand of his beloved wife. He noticed instantly that it was no longer warm and soft. He placed a delicate kiss onto the back of it. "Well, my darling, it looks like we have to leave you alone now," he began. "David has spoken with the doctor. They will take care of you now. I must get back to the house to feed the cats. They'll be wondering what's going on. You know what they're like." He smiled warmly at her. Behind him, David began to sob. This triggered his sister and wife to join in. Harold looked up to them, smiling reassuringly. "Don't cry. You know it upsets your mother to see you like this. Let's go and get that cup of tea, eh?" The days following her death, Harold had left the organisation of the funeral to his children. In truth, he would have been glad of the distraction, as the intervening time had done nothing to remove the emptiness he felt in his heart. The small kitchen of the house they had shared seemed vast and echoing as he sat looking at an empty chair. He had been there since 5 a.m, as he couldn't sleep in their bedroom, not when he knew she would never lay beside him again. The peach floral curtains were drawn back, letting the sunlight fill the room. Rays of light bounced off their silver spoon collection that hung in a wooden display cabinet on the wall opposite. The cabinet had been made by Harold, as Sarah wanted somewhere to place the spoons they had collected from various holidays around the world. There was a knock on the door, and he heard it open. "Dad, you up and about?" It was David. Harold looked towards the door to the hallway he knew David was walking down. The kitchen was the long galley type, though it only contained 3 base cabinets, with 2 having cupboards above them. The door David was about to walk through had a clock beside it, and Harold noted the time was just after 10 a.m. His son had been coming the same time every morning since the day after she had gone. "In here, son," Harold called back. "Ah, there you are. You okay, Dad?" David asked as he walked into the room. He asked the same question every morning, and Harold closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to compose himself. "Yes, thank you, son," he sighed. This isn't the reply he wanted to give. He wanted to say that he was broken inside, and the thought of spending any more time without his wife brought such pain that he didn't feel he could continue. "Pop the kettle on, will you?" he asked with a wink. Harold watched as David busied himself filling up the kettle before picking out his father's favourite cup and dropping a tea bag into it. "Have you eaten today, Dad?" he asked as he picked out his own special cup. "What? No, I didn't feel like anything," Harold replied. "Dad, you have to eat," David chastised as he opened another cupboard and brought out a tin of beans. "I'll make you some beans on toast, how about that?" Harold nodded. He wasn't hungry, but he didn't have the energy to argue about it, so he would go along. There was a click as the kettle finished boiling the water. A few moments later, David placed the tea on the table and moved to sit down beside him, waiting for the toast to pop up. "Did you watch the football last night?" he asked after a moment. "Everton were playing. I know you never miss a game." "Sorry?" Harold blinked and looked at his son. "Football? No. I didn't know it was on, and I went to bed early." "Did they win?" Harold pulled the handle of his cup, twisting it as he did to see the message printed on the side. He placed a finger onto the words, "World's Best Husband," and grinned. "You know," he said, not waiting for the reply to his previous question, "your mum bought this for me for our 10th wedding anniversary." He looked up to see David raise his eyebrows and shake his head. "World's best husband." Harold sniffed. "I wish I was, son. I'd like to think your mum never doubted she had made the right decision to marry me. Even though there were times when I'll be out with the lads late, then crawl into bed long after midnight, stinking of beer." He looked up at his son. Do you know what she would say to me?" David shook his head again and smiled. "She would place her warm arm over my shoulder, then reach across to kiss my cheek. 'Good night, darling,' she would say. 'I hope you had a good time with your friends.'" His eyes filled with tears. Can you believe that? All the times I had told her I wouldn't be late, yet each and every time I would be. He shook his head, but she never complained. She always pulled me close while I fell asleep. Harold stared into the cup as David reached across and wiped the tear that had run down his cheek. The action broke his reverie, and as he looked into his son's eyes, he saw only sympathy and concern. The sound of the toaster popping up seemed to give him something to focus on. "Ah, the toast is ready," David said as he pulled himself up from the chair and grabbed a clean plate from the draining board. The kitchen filled with the aroma of toast mixed with the smell of the beans cooking on the stove. A short while later, Harold had a plate of beans on toast placed in front of him, along with cutlery and condiments. "The funeral will be on Thursday next week, Dad," David said as Harold pushed food around the plate. He knew David would be uncomfortable with this topic, and he knew it really should be him arranging these things. But somehow he couldn't find the energy or time. "Moira said she'll be coming over in the morning," David continued, "to help you get ready. Lisa and I will come about 11 to wait with you both for the car to come. The service will be at St. Thomas's, Dad, the same place you and Mum were married." Harold looked at his son and smiled. He knew the service could be held at any church around his house, but the significance of St. Thomas's was something he could see David had thought about. "I felt it would be an apt place to say our goodbyes." "That's nice, son. Your mum would like that," Harold said as he willed himself to place some of the beans he had chased around the plate into his mouth. "It was a lovely wedding. Your mother looked stunning," he said before swallowing a forkful of the beans. "Beautiful day it was. Mid-March 1957. Scorcher of a day. Your mum wore this slim-fitting dress, and I remember saying to my pal John, 'Are you sure she is here to marry me?' He laughed at the memory. He was as confused as me, you know. He said she couldn't be because if she was, then I would be the luckiest man alive. And I was." Harold sighed and tried to eat the food, and found himself to be hungrier than he had thought. "Such a lovely day," he said, before placing the last of the toast into his mouth. He watched as David cleared away the plate and began to wash the pots in the sink. He wanted to say something, but his mind was filled only with the memories of his wedding day, and couldn't quite grasp what he knew he should say. "Thank you, son," he said eventually. "That was a lovely breakfast." "Don't be daft, Dad. It was just beans on toast. Lisa would be amazed I even managed that. It used to be pot noodles and bread when I was living on my own," he laughed. The sound felt strange in the kitchen, though Harold found himself smiling back at his son as he placed the now clean plate into the rack beside the sink. "I suppose I'll have to get some pot noodles then, eh, son?" He forced another smile and watched as David's face filled with emotion. "Oh, Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. David began. "Now who's being daft?" Harold said. "I like the odd pot noodle. Beef and tomato, though." David smiled as he turned his head back to the sink and began rinsing the knife and fork. "Don't suppose you'd be able to pick me up a couple, would you, David?" What was he doing? His son was upset, and he could only think to ask for shopping. "Of course I can, Dad. Beef and tomato. I'll remember that and pop them round later if that's okay." Harold nodded. "Whenever you have time, son." He smiled. Harold sat in the kitchen, watching the birds flit from the windowsill outside to the bird table a few feet away in the garden.
It's a lovely morning, darling. I think I may have to get the mower out of the shed, as it's been a while since the grass was cut.
He shrugged and looked back at the chair beside him. The sound of the front door banging shut broke his train of thought, and he looked up to see his daughter, Moira, walking into the kitchen. Her dark hair was tied back neatly in a tight ponytail, and she had on a black two-piece trouser suit. She reminded him so much of her mum.
"Morning, Dad," she said cheerily. "You had your breakfast yet?"
Harold looked up and shook his head.
"Not yet, love. I'm waiting for your mother to get up."
Moira stopped in her tracks and turned to look at him, with her eyes filling with tears.
"Mum's not getting up, Dad. She died, remember?"
Harold stared at her as he let the words float around his mind. It took a few seconds, but when the realization came, he felt like she had been taken away from him all over again.
"That's right, love,"
he sighed.
"I'm sorry, I don't know what I was thinking."
He returned his gaze to the chair and remembered the mornings when she would be sat there waiting for him to come downstairs.
She always had a cuppa waiting for me. Always a hot one too. I don't know how she did it, as her hearing wasn't great, but she somehow knew when I would be down,
Harold said as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair.
"She was very good at knowing what we wanted, Dad. You're right there,"
Moira replied. She still watched him with some concern on her face, so he straightened his shoulders to appear more awake than he felt.
"Are you sure you were okay, Dad?"
Harold nodded his head in response, though he was far from okay. The woman he had loved so deeply was gone. How is it possible to be okay following that?
"You mentioned a cup of tea, love,"
he said to change the subject. Moira smiled and turned to take his cup from the side and then filled the kettle.
"I actually asked if you had eaten, which, given your response, I'm taking as a no."
Her voice reminded him of Sarah, and he instinctively nodded in agreement. A few minutes later, he had an egg and bacon sandwich and a hot cup of tea in front of him. As he began to eat, he looked up to see Moira sitting in his wife's chair. The sight hit him hard, and he was about to ask her to move when he realized that it would be silly to do so. She wasn't going to need the chair any longer. He finished the sandwich, then started to drink his tea in silence. Today was the day he had to say goodbye formally. Although he was prepared, he didn't feel like letting go just yet.
"It looks like the weather is going to hold for the day, Dad," Moira said, breaking the silence. "Not bad for October, really. The radio said in the car on the way here that it was 8 degrees already, so it should be nice and warm by lunchtime."
Harold nodded absently as he sipped his drink.
"I've been packing some things away, love," he said as the thought came to him. "I found some things of yours. I put them in that box over there."
He indicated the direction with his chin. Moira turned to see a few boxes stacked near the door to the hall. She moved over to examine them.
"You've been busy, Dad. You've put labels on and everything."
Harold watched as she read the little stickers, clearly looking for her box. She picked up a couple of the boxes, and Harold knew they were a box of memories, a box for David and one for his wife, Sarah. When Moira had found hers, she paused, looking back at the one she had moved aside before bringing hers back to the table. Harold sipped at his tea as his daughter looked through certificates and old toys from her childhood before finding a bundle of old photographs. Pulling the bundle out, she took the photos from the envelope and began to look through them.
"I remember this day,"
she exclaimed as she turned the photograph to show her father.
"Do you remember this, Dad?"
Moira asked. Harold looked at the picture of his daughter swinging from a branch, with her mother stood beneath with arms outstretched as if to catch her should she fall. He grinned. "I remember that well, love. Your mum was so protective of you that she had to be convinced to let you swing in that tree like your brother had. You were such a tomboy that you always followed what David had done and managed to get far more bumps than he ever did." He pointed at the photograph. "It wasn't long after your 7th birthday. We decided to take you both to the Lake District for a picnic and do some exploring. It rained all the way up, but your mum kept everyone's spirits high by singing along to ABBA on the radio, as well as making up her own songs to make us laugh." He looked away for a second and gazed out of the window into the garden to find a robin looking back at him through the window. "Such a beautiful singing voice she had. Would charm the birds from the trees." Harold looked at his daughter and then back to the photograph. She had changed so much, but then not much at all. Her curly brown hair looked so much like her mother's, and she had never grown out of those delicate features that made her such a pretty girl. Beautiful woman, he supposed. He let his eyes flick back to his little girl and saw Sarah in her face. Moira smiled as she continued to flick through the photos, and Harold once again felt he should say something, but couldn't quite find the words. Sarah would know exactly what to say. She was always so good at finding the right words when they were needed. He felt himself drifting off into memories as he watched his daughter deliberately pick out photo after photo to examine the memories captured in them. He could see she was hurting, but couldn't find the words. "Your mum," he began. "She was always taking pictures." He smiled. Sarah was so much better at this kind of thing, he thought. "Yes," she answered as she hurriedly placed the photographs back into their envelope. "I suppose we should be getting ready," she said as she stood, then took away his plate and teacup, then began tidying around the kitchen. Harold watched as she wiped her eyes more than once between menial tasks that could clearly wait. "You don't need to do that, love," he said as Moira began to run hot water into the sink. "I will clean them later. If your mum saw them, I'd be in trouble," he said. Moira turned as she mumbled something about his suit jacket, which he missed, before heading out of the kitchen. The front door slammed shut as Lisa bowled in with Dave following behind her. "Sorry we're late. We couldn't get Jennifer settled at my brother's house," Lisa said as she strolled into the kitchen. "She was adamant she had to come with us to see her nana and say goodbye." Harold noticed David nudge her in the back, then frown at her. "I'm sorry," she began. "I didn't mean—" Harold raised a hand and smiled. "It's okay," Harold said. "Her nan would have loved to have her there, but these things aren't the places for little girls. I'm sure she can pop over to enjoy a sandwich and some fizzy drink another day when we can have a chat." He looked at them both, then shrugged. "It's up to you, of course." "Absolutely," David said after it was clear someone should say something. "Jenny would love that. I'll mention it when we pick her up, and then let you know when we can come over." Harold nodded, then got up from his chair. Moira had returned with his jacket and began trying to help him put it on. "Look, love, I am old, but I'm not incapable of putting on my own jacket. Stop fussing, I'll be fine." With that, she passed him the coat and stood back. "I'll just go see if the cars have arrived," she said before heading to the front room. The kitchen went silent as David, Lisa and Harold stood awkwardly waiting for the transport to come. "How's work, son?" Harold asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. "Oh, busy. We have a new CEO and she's bringing in some fresh new ideas from the States. So it's all a bit up in the air at the moment." He looked at his wife, who shook her head slightly, clearly an indication that whatever he was thinking of saying, he shouldn't. Harold smiled, watching the interaction. I see. When you say up in the air, you mean there's some instability? Maybe around your job? Harold asked. Dave's eyes widened, and he knew his son was now regretting the conversation topic. Harold smiled. His son hadn't been able to get anything past him, ever. Well, a little, but I don't want to bother you with that today, Dad. Let's leave it for another time, yeah? David said. Harold had been a career-driven man. He had managed to work his way up through the ranks to become a director of a national insurance company. Noticing the small details is what had served him so well in that pursuit. Standing there, he considered how these little things had meant he and Sarah could bring up their children in their lovely Victorian detached house on the northern coast of Cornwall, with ample gardens for the children to run around exploring. Yes, it was the small details that were so important when climbing the corporate ladder. He had honed that gift to perfection. Unfortunately, he had never used that talent to spot the cracks in his own marriage. He was far too focused on his career to see something back then that would be as plain as the nose on his face if he looked at it today. Putting that to the back of his mind, he looked at his son. He was a good-looking boy with short black hair and shimmering blue eyes like his mother. He was a few inches taller than himself, and it made him proud to see the man he had become. Listen, son, Harold said, waving away the look on his daughter-in-law's face. The thing about change is that it comes to us all, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do about it. The best thing for you to do is adapt and either find security in the company you are with or look elsewhere, which, given you are my boy, I suspect is what you have already done. Am I right? The resigned shrug of David's shoulders told him he was correct. Well, he started to say. Dave, I don't think this is the right time or place for this discussion, do you? Lisa rebuked. Of course it isn't. You're quite right, dear. David nodded enthusiastically, hoping that this settled the matter. So, where is your new job, son? Harold asked. Once again, his astute instincts caught his son by surprise. Eh? Was all David could say. Your new job. Listen, I'm not daft, and looking at the situation, there's something that you want to tell me. But because we are saying goodbye to your mum, you don't think it's the right time. Now, that tells me you either have an illness, someone else has died, or, more likely, you are moving away. If he had a mic, this would be the opportune time to drop it. Lisa shrugged as her husband looked to her for support, but clearly this was going to have to be his decision. You're right, Dad. I started looking before Mum died. I attended a couple of interviews and heard back a couple of days ago. He moved towards his father and placed a hand on his shoulder. Look, it's not a million miles away and we can still come to visit, don't you worry about that. Right, Lisa? Once again, he looked to his wife for support. Yep, once or twice a month maybe, she replied. So, you see, we'll still come and see you, David said. That's lovely, son. But you haven't told me where your job is or what you'll be doing. The room quietened again as looks were exchanged between his son and daughter-in-law. Eventually, Dave caved in. France. The job is in France, the south to be exact. It's for a brokerage company based down there. They want me to head up my own division. The money is great and the prospects are, well, they're great too. Harold reached out his hand and his son took it. Congratulations, David. I am really proud of you. I'm sure you will settle in quickly. I believe the south of France is lovely. Lisa nodded, but she didn't appear too enthusiastic. Harold maintained a fixed smile to reassure his son that everything would be okay. Inside, his stomach churned. He had come to rely on his son's visits, especially when he brought his granddaughter with him. Jennifer made him laugh so much that it was easy to forget what he had lost in that cheeky grin and mischievous personality.
"The cars are here,"
Moira called. The announcement gave everyone the opportunity to leave the kitchen and the conversation behind them. Harold slowly walked up the path of the cemetery towards his wife's grave. It had been a month since the funeral, and he had made the same trip at 10 a.m. every day. The wind had picked up and was tugging at the last remaining leaves on the trees. He pulled his coat around himself tighter as he reached the plot overlooking the town below.
"I say this every day, my love, but David really did well with this spot. It's a stunning view you have here."
He turned and admired the view himself.
"Look down there. That's where the ballroom used to be. Do you remember?"
The ballroom was where they had gone on their first proper date. He had enjoyed it immensely. Holding this beautiful woman close to him as his friends, as well as other men, looked on enviously. It felt like he was dancing on air.
"Do you remember our third date, when we danced right up till closing and had to be booted out? We walked back to your parents' house on Church Street hand in hand. I remember looking down at our hands combined. I recall feeling at peace with everything. It just felt right. Do you know what I mean?"
He started to brush some leaves off the top of her gravestone before picking them from the grass on and around it. He placed the dead leaves into his pocket so he could put them into the bin on his way home.
"I miss those times, love. I wish we could do it all over again."
He sighed as he traced his wife's name on the stone with a finger. Sarah Moira Wood, beloved wife, mother and grandmother. Let her rest now in peace. 1938 to 1998.
"It's such a short life you had, my darling. Far too short. I only wish I could be with you now. I'm not coping very well since Dave, Lisa and Jenny left for France. Moira tries to visit as often as she can, but she lives 3 hours away and has her own life to lead."
A sudden thought occurred to him, and he quickly changed the subject. "I very nearly forgot. I have news about our little girl. She has only gone and found herself a partner. Can you believe it? Our little girl has found someone who will take her on." He laughed.
"You would really like her. She makes Moira smile, which is a good thing. Her name is Karen. She's a lovely girl. I met her when I went up on the train last week. They're so happy, you know. They're looking for a place together as well. I did wonder if they would look down here, but obviously they both have jobs to consider and moving away isn't really a good time right now."
Reaching into his pocket, he took out a folded-up mat, then placed it on the ground before settling down upon it.
"Funny thing, Moira didn't want to tell me about her and Karen. Apparently she was worried about how I'd react to her telling me she's a lesbian."
He laughed again.
"As if I would feel any differently about my baby just because she happens to like women," I said to her. "Well," I said, "that's something we have in common. I like women too."
He laughed at his own wit and smiled, shaking his head.
"She cried, you know, right there in her front room. I said to her, 'Why are you crying?' Do you know what she said? She reckoned I would take the news badly because because you're not here. As if I am one to tell people who they can and cannot fall in love with, especially since I fell in love with you. And nobody thought that was a good idea at all."
He kissed his hand and placed it onto her name. Harold sat for a moment and reflected.
"I can't believe I forgot to tell you that. I'm such a scatterbrain these days.
Harold lay back against the stone and took in a deep breath of autumnal air. The sun had risen over the town below, and he could see the sea stretching into the horizon. The smell of salt was prominent as he closed his eyes and tilted his face to the sun. I do love it here. We were right to move here from London. A smile broke onto his face. Well, when I say we, I obviously mean you. It was you who found the house after all, and I didn't really want to leave the hustle and bustle of the city, but you were right. I do love it here. Harold reached into his coat pocket and removed a silver flask. Removing the lid, he poured the hot liquid into it before placing the flask on the ground beside him. He wrapped his fingers around the now hot lid and felt the warmth flood into his hands. Perfect, he said as he took a sip of the tea. Once he had finished the drink, Harold got back to his feet, then placed the now folded mat back into his pocket along with a flask of tea. Well, I'm gonna get off. I have the social services coming around to talk about my needs. I don't think they can give me what I want, though. Not that kind of service, eh? He winked and took in a deep breath before slowly letting it go. I will see you tomorrow, love. Same time, he said as he began to move away. Oh, he said as he turned, remembering something he wanted to say. Moira is coming next week with Karen, so maybe I'll bring them to see you. Would you like that? He nodded in response to an unheard answer. I knew you would. As he started to walk away, he glanced back and blew a final kiss towards his wife. The snow had fallen hard during the night, and Harold cursed as he slipped and stumbled up the hill towards the grave. It had taken him far too long to get there, and he was way past the time he usually arrived. She would be worried, he knew that, but he was also sure she would understand. Phew, what an effort to get up this hill, love, he said as he finally made it to the graveside. So sorry I am late, but as you can see, the snow has covered everything in sight. He pulled off his glove and started to sweep the snow from her name. Such a beautiful view, love, especially with this blanket of white. He stood for a second or two beside the gravestone looking out across the town. It was as though a blanket of white had been laid across everything he could see. The stark brown of the sea was clearly visible, although if it snowed again, even the sands would be covered in white as the tide had gone completely out. Well, it'll be Christmas in a couple of days, he began. I've been asked to go and spend it with David in the south of France. Can you imagine that? A Christmas day not in our house? Harold shrugged. I'm not keen on the idea, if I'm totally honest. I'm still considering telling him no. He brushed the snow from the top of the stone as he thought about the idea. I don't think I will go. I would miss you too much. Do you know, we have spent every Christmas day together for over 40 years. I really don't want us to miss this one. He sighed as he finished clearing the snow. I know, he said. I need to move on. That's what Barry from Social Services keeps saying. They've been trying to get me to go to bereavement counselling. But I keep telling them I don't need it. There are others who are struggling more than me, and anyway, what would you do if I didn't come to see you? He let the question hang in the air before continuing. I didn't tell you, did I? I went to the doctor's on Tuesday. She gave me some pills to help me sleep. Apparently it's a common problem after losing a loved one, she tells me. I just need a few hours a night, so I asked for something mild. I haven't taken them yet, but maybe tonight I'll have one with a cup of hot chocolate. He paused to catch his breath. I've been struggling with my breathing too. Nothing to worry about, love. Just getting a cold, I think. What's that?
Yes, I am wearing enough layers, he sniggered. You never stop mothering me, do you? Anyway, the doctor wants me to go back next week if I haven't improved. But maybe a good night's sleep will sort it all out, eh?
A bird called above him as it landed on the branch of a snow-covered tree. The resulting shower forced Harold to take a step backwards to save getting covered in it. As he stepped, he lost his footing and fell hard to the ground. There was a ringing in his ears as he opened his eyes and found several worried faces looking down at him. The feeling of movement told him he was no longer with his wife.
Where am I?
He asked the nearest face.
Hello, sir. Glad you're back with us. We were getting worried. What's your name, then?
The face asked. Harold looked and saw it was a man's face, all smiles and teeth, but he had kind eyes.
Harold,
he answered after a moment's thought.
Harold Wood.
Is it okay if I call you Harold? The man asked, and Harold nodded. Okay. My name is Terence, and I am a paramedic. You were found unconscious at St. Thomas's graveyard. Looks like you have slipped in the snow and banged your head. We are just on our way to the general hospital where they can check you out and hopefully give you the all clear. Do you understand? Harold nodded again and tentatively tried to lift his head. No, Harold, you need to stay still for me, okay? Terence said as he placed a hand onto Harold's chest. After feeling the pain of lifting his head, he didn't really need the advice, as he wasn't going to try again anytime soon. Do you have anyone we can call to let them know where you are, Harold? Terence asked, as he made some notes on his pad.
No one close by. My daughter and her partner live a few hours away, but I wouldn't want to bother them this close to Christmas. My son lives in the south of France, so that's even further.
He took a deep breath and felt it catch in his chest and let out a wheeze. Terence was on him instantly with a stethoscope. Got a bit of a chest infection, Harold? He asked as he listened to his breathing.
I'm getting a cold, that's all.
Okay, but I think I will add that to your notes just to be sure, as it does sound a little nasty in there. Harold grimaced as the pain that had been hiding in his confusion suddenly made itself known.
My wife, he said as he realised. I didn't say goodbye to her.
Terence looked confused. You have a wife? Would you like us to call her? Harold shook his head, as much as the pain would allow.
No, I was visiting her grave and haven't said goodbye. She will worry, you see.
The kind smile filled Terence's face. I understand, Harold. I am sure she will too. Harold hoped she would, but just in case, he promised that when he got out of this hospital, he would buy an extra big bunch of flowers to show how sorry he was. The walking stick clicked each time it struck the path as Harold slowly ascended the hill. It had been 3 weeks since his last visit. All the snow had been replaced by a cold January mist that hung in the air, bringing a chill to his bones. In his free hand, he carried a large bunch of flowers wrapped in a ribbon sprinkled with glitter.
I am so sorry I haven't been to see you, my love, he said as he arrived at the graveside. You may remember the last time I was here, I had a little slip.
He placed the flowers on top of the grave, then kissed his hand before pressing it on her name.
Yes, I know I should have been more careful. I cracked my head good and proper, so had to stay in the hospital for a few days. Then Moira wouldn't let me leave the house, so I've not been able to get up to see you.
He looked out across the town, as he always did, taking a few deep breaths to recover from the walk up the hill, each one rattling in his chest.
This blooming cold won't shift either. Fortunately, Moira has had to go back to work, So I can now escape my prison to come and see you."
He smiled wanly.
"Oh, Karen came down to stay for the weekend just past. She is perfect for our baby girl, love. You would get on like a house on fire. You really would."
He gave a little sniff and pulled his coat tighter around himself.
"I did ask if they wanted to come to visit. They said they would try, but I don't think they had the time. What with looking after me and worrying about their own problems."
The flower petals blew in the chill air. He wanted to wrap them in something to keep them fresh, but like all the other collections of now dead offerings, he knew it would be a futile thing to do.
"Apparently, they are getting some nastiness from certain people in their street. I don't understand some folk."
He shook his head sadly.
"Why does it matter to them that a couple who love each other live in their street?"
He rubbed his hands together to get some warmth in them.
"Moira and Karen were telling me they've had notes posted through their door, telling them that they're not welcome. It's blooming ridiculous. All these people need to do is take the time to get to know them. Such a lovely couple."
He took another deep, gurgling breath. The fall and his recovery from it had taken a toll on Harold. He found his mental agility was slightly slower than it had been. During his checkup, he'd been sent for an MRI. They discovered that he had fractured his skull and that there had been a small bleed on his brain. The doctors had assured him it was only minor, but as with all bleeds, they couldn't be sure about the impact on his faculties. He was now being asked to visit his GP regularly, as well as monthly hospital visits for a while, so he could be monitored. He wasn't going to trouble Sarah with this news, especially given she was likely worried about Moira and Karen now anyway. Instead, he focused on the good things going on around him.
"Dave and Lisa sent me a letter this week. They are really sorry they haven't been over to visit. They have been really busy setting up their new house, apparently. David's new job has meant long days for him while he establishes himself. It's a wonderful opportunity for them. It's just a shame not to have seen them all for so long."
He rested on his walking stick as another need to inhale deeply came over him. These breaths were accompanied by the now familiar rattle in his chest.
"Anyway, they are planning to come over in the spring, when it gets a bit warmer in the UK.
A rabbit popped its head around a grave a little down the hill from where he stood. He watched as it hopped a few times until it stopped to sniff the air before dropping its head to the grass and starting to nibble.
"Since I've been unable to get out of the house, I have taken the opportunity to pack some things away."
He coughed a few times, and the rattle became more pronounced.
"It came to me as I packed. There's one thing I have always wanted to talk about. It has been on my mind a very long time."
Harold's lips pressed together, then twisted as though trying to stop the words inside his mouth escaping. But it had to be said, so he pressed on. "It came back to me as I found some of our letters from when we weren't getting along so well. You remember the ones where we talked about our relationship following your mistake with that man?" It had been 25 years, and still Harold could not bring himself to say his name.
"I never told you how I felt properly. I was just so happy we didn't break up at the time. I didn't want to upset you or jeopardize us."
He closed his eyes slowly. He had become incredibly wearied since his accident. He had gone through the conversation in his mind as he'd made his way to the cemetery, but now he was here. It felt insignificant. He took another gulp of air, feeling he had started, so must finish.
"It has been on my mind of late. So I wanted this chance to let you know. Is that okay?
The trees creaked as the wind whipped up and shook the branches overhead. Remembering the last time he was here, Harold looked up nervously to make sure nothing was going to fall down on him. Satisfied he was safe, he continued.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I don't blame you at all for looking for comfort elsewhere. I was in a difficult place mentally, what with changes at work and the stress of trying to balance a long commute with family life. I know I should have talked to you sooner, but I didn't know how to.
He thought back to that time and shrugged as the memories came flooding back.
I was so miserable, love. I neglected the one thing I should never have taken my eyes from, and that was you. I know you were sorry. You told me so many times. I also know we got past it all, living happily until, well, you know.
A tear began to form in his eye, and he blinked to free it.
I never really told you how it felt for me to learn about the affair. I was so angry at first that I couldn't see anything but my rage. In that moment, I truly wanted to harm him, telling you I would go to his house to confront him. You were, as ever, the voice of reason. You promised that you and he were through, convincing me that I would only be putting myself at risk should I go through with it.
His voice croaked as he continued speaking through the tears.
The lies cut so deep, though, Sarah. Then I found out you had continued to meet with him. I honestly thought I would prefer to be dead than live with the knowledge that you thought so little of me that my feelings did not matter to you anymore. I considered my options for a long while. I struggled to convince myself not to take my own life. Each time the thought arose, I remembered we had children. It was the thought of them trying to cope without me around that kept me from going through with it.
Tears were now rolling down his face as he let the memories bring the pain of those times back with them.
I never got over it, you know. Knowing I was second choice behind him made me feel so insignificant and insecure, but I never recovered. The broken heart only mended enough to allow me to move on. In truth, I always thought you would leave me again. I wouldn't have blamed you, to be honest, as I wasn't able to be the husband you deserved after that.
A heavy sob left his mouth as years of repressed emotions flooded to the surface, and he wavered on his stick under the weight of them.
I only ever wanted to make you happy. Even knowing you would have preferred to be with him, I took solace in the fact you stayed. Though I suppose it was really the children that kept us together.
He paused to compose himself as the wave of emotions passed over him. He had thought this would be an easy conversation, give him the opportunity to speak what had laid dormant but always there for so long. But he was struggling. He was becoming breathless as he let the words spill out of him.
I made a promise that I would try so hard to put this behind me. I wanted to keep you as happy as I could, and that's what I did. I just think that now is as good a time as any to let you know how much and how deeply your affair hurt me. The impact on my mental state lasted for several years. It was a long time until I had the ability to look at you without thinking of him and your... Well, you know what I'm getting at.
He closed his eyes and cried. it was several minutes before he felt able to continue.
I want you to know that I forgave you a long time ago, but that I have finally found it within me to forgive myself for not seeing things had gone so wrong. I hope you can forgive me, my love, and that you are happy with your choice.
He thought for a moment.
Maybe you have now got the chance to spend some time with him, he asked, knowing the other man had died several years before his wife. He stood for a few more minutes in silence before kissing his hand and placing it on her name. Goodbye, my love. Thanks for listening and being so understanding. I will see you tomorrow.
He turned and slowly made his way back down the hill towards the waiting taxi. Moira and her brother stood before the grave of their mother. Moira wept as David placed an arm around her and pulled her close.
Mum,
she sobbed.
Dad asked me to come and let you know how sorry he was that he hasn't been to see you for a while, and to let you know he couldn't make it today. He wanted me to tell you that if it wasn't for the doctors, he would have been here himself.
She dropped to her knees onto her mother's grave and rested her head against the stone. Dave knelt beside his sister, chest heaving from the emotion he was trying to suppress. The spring air was warm as the birds sang over their heads, but they didn't notice. Only the sound of their sorrow filled their ears today.
He died, Mum,
Dave began.
Last night around 10. We got a call from the hospital yesterday morning to let us know he was slipping away. He had been ill for quite some time. You see, the fall he had at Christmas caused a lot more damage than they originally thought. That, coupled with his recurring pneumonia, meant he was too weak to fend off a simple chest infection.
Moira lifted her head before turning to her brother.
Why didn't we come more often, Dave? He needed us, but we left him alone.
Dave shook his head regretfully. I know. Believe me, I wish I had done things differently. Throwing myself into a new job, telling myself I would come visit next weekend. Always next weekend. David rested his hands on top of the gravestone. Please forgive us, Mum. We didn't want it to be like this. Behind them, Lisa had climbed the hill with Jennifer and was standing back while her husband and sister-in-law grieved. I don't even know why we are talking to a stone, Dave said as he tried to compose himself.
Because that's what he asked us to do, and we certainly owe him more than this,
Moira snapped. Dave nodded and looked down, not able to meet her eye.
Mum, the funeral will be held next Tuesday, on your wedding anniversary as it happens. Dave has pulled several strings, as well as paying quite a lot of money to make sure Dad is buried next to you on this hill.
She looked beside the grave at where her dad would be placed in less than a week.
He loved you so much, Mum. Even at the end, he said he saw you walking down the hospital corridors, waiting for him to join you. I am so sorry we let you down.
She began to cry again. Dave stood up. He paused for a moment before taking his sister's hand to guide her back to her feet. They had delivered the message, so there was nothing more to be said. He took Moira's arm, then moved her away from the grave. The cars lined the road outside the church. The sun shone through the clouds above as the newly budding trees swayed in the spring breeze. There was a huge turnout for the funeral, with many relatives from the area and beyond making their way to say their last goodbyes to Harold. Lisa stood with Dave and their daughter Jennifer, all dressed in black, while they waited for the coffin to be lifted out from the car. As the back of the hearse opened, Dave moved towards it and stood in his place so he could carry his father into the same church he had carried his mother less than 6 months before. Moira stood with Karen as tears rolled unchecked down her face. Karen's arm pulling her close to comfort her, as she too shared the grief of Harold's passing as they watched the coffin move past them into the church. The service was heartfelt and beautiful, exactly as their father deserved. The hymns were sung with deep emotion as friends and colleagues from their father's life filled the room with their voices. The final procession from the church to the graveside was done in silence, each of them taking the time to collect their thoughts and prepare their final goodbyes. The vicar spoke well of their father, as he had known him over the past few years. "We are gathered here for the final time to say our farewells to Harold Joseph Wood, a man of great character who brought love and laughter into the hearts of many, especially to all of us who stand here today. His passing has come as a great shock to his children David and Moira, their partners Lisa and Karen, as well as his granddaughter Jennifer. But I will tell them, as well as all those who can hear my voice, that this is merely a part of God's wisdom, a knowing that two souls so connected in life could not be kept apart for long. And now they are rejoined in our Father's paradise, to live there forevermore." They all watched as the earth was thrown into the grave, landing on top of his coffin with a thud. Moira blew one final kiss towards her father, then turned to leave, with Karen holding her hand. David bowed his head respectfully, before taking a handful of soil and dropping it into the hole. "I am so sorry, Dad. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me for my selfishness," he asked. "I really wish I'd had the chance to speak with you one more time. I have so much to say." He felt the now familiar tears well in his eyes as he looked down onto his father's coffin. Deciding it was time to go, he took hold of his daughter's hand, then turned to leave.
"Wait, Daddy, can I say goodbye to Grandad?"
Jennifer asked. Lisa looked at Dave, who dismissed the look of concern in his wife's eyes.
"Of course you can, sweetie. You let him know how much you loved him, okay?"
he replied. Jennifer stood near the edge of the grave with her mother hovering behind her. She took some soil and tossed it in just as her father had done.
"Grandad, I will miss you so much. I will always remember how you made me laugh and that you gave me cakes and biscuits when my mummy and daddy weren't watching."
Lisa smiled, then looked at Dave, who was now sobbing uncontrollably.
"I hope you and Nana are happy now you are together again. I love you both loads and loads. Goodbye."
With that, she blew a kiss like her auntie had, then walked off with her parents, leaving the men behind to put the rest of the soil into the grave. Harold watched as his children walked down the path towards their cars, and smiled a contented smile as he felt the warm, soft hand of his wife take hold of his.
"It will be all right,"
she said as she laid her head on his shoulder.
"Are you ready to leave?"
Harold took one last admiring look at the graveyard and the town below it. Such a beautiful view, love. David really did do a wonderful job getting this spot. With one final look over his shoulder, he walked with his wife, hand in hand, into eternity.